Well, welcome back to another session. I hope you are well. In today's session, I will be bringing to a close the list of traits that identify whether there is a beta gene in you as a man. I started these list of observations and character traits about 4 sessions ago. The idea was to help men understand whether there were behaviors, traits that they had which were consistent with having or being referred to as the beta male, but also to help women understand the kind of men or caliber of men who are either pursuing them or who they are in a relationship with. Before I start today's session, preface today's session by reminding you of something that I shared at the start. Number one, when we talk about beta, it comes from, the word itself comes from the Greek language, simply referring to second. I use the computer reference to explain how a software that is created at beta stage is usually at an advanced stage of development, but it's not complete. It's at a stage where you can get feedback. I use the software analogy to explain that most men have the physical attributes of men. In other words, the hardware is masculine, or male rather, perhaps a better word to use. The hardware is male, but the software operating, you might say the hardware, or the software in the hardware is feminine and therefore female or beta. I started by giving you a long list of, providing a list of items and observations and character traits. But it was important that I refer to something that I think is crucial. Number one, when I talk about beta, I'm not using it from a pejorative position. I'm not using it from a place of moral or morality or amoral position, or rather this is an amoral conversation. It's not a value judgment, it's simply an observation of what you can do about it, if you want to. Number two, it has nothing to do with your intellect, or your mental state, or your abilities. It has more to do with your emotions, but more so even relationally. That's the key part of what I'm focusing on. Some years ago, I started a series of lectures, as I call them, in which I talked about how to assess a man's value. And from that, I developed something called How to Assess a Woman's Value. I produced some weeks and months ago an updated version of those series of sessions in which I explained a man's value can be assessed in various ways. There were two that were very important that I focused on. In any case, there were 10 video sessions, and I explained that a man's economic intrinsic value, EIV, a man's manhood value, MV, a man's character value, CV, a man's non-sexual marketplace value, N, SMP, a man's reproductive fertility value, RFV, a man's gentleman value, GV, and more, all play a part in assessing a man's overall value. But there were two that were key. One was CV, character value. Two, MV, manhood value. In many ways, MV was the key component because that connected to the man's purpose, and it was upon which the character was built. And I postulated that if you took the character value and the manhood value, they would make up probably about 60%, sometimes more, of a man's overall value. I think in my position, my place, I would have pushed that towards 70 in some instances. In other words, a man who has good character and who has the right masculine frame, in other words, his manhood value is high, will score about 7 out of 10 in the score for men. The others, sexual marketplace value, SMV, and all the others are added bonuses because effectively he has the right foundation. I also explained at the start, you're born a male, you develop into boyhood through the process of modeling or influence of other people. The process of going from boyhood to manhood requires work, study, practice, a lot of education, a lot of failure, a lot of development of your understanding, raising your awareness. To journey from manhood to being a gentleman requires a craft. So you're born male, you're made through work into a man, but you're crafted into a gentleman. Beta males tend to have an unfortunate disadvantage in that they lose the manhood process. So they might go from being male to boys, and they skip the whole manhood process and move straight to being gentlemen. And I've given several opportunities and reasons why this happens. There were many. I won't go through the list. Let me start today's session in any case. There are 3 items left. Item number 13, item number 14, and item number 15. Now, for those who perhaps don't understand, you might want to go back and look back at some of the items I have covered. I have provided 12 items already. These are the last 3. Now, I should also state, like most things, I sat down and I put pen to paper and came up with 15 items. At the end of this series, taking into account that the way we think sometimes is by talking about concepts. I might come up with new ones, who knows. In any case, number 13 is a man who prefers female company rather than male company or companionship. In other words, I know people, and I know people I am acquainted to. And on one particular occasion, we were having a conversation and I said, well, why don't you audit your friends? Or audit the friends that you have? Or audit the friends that you have within your circle? And it's a simple question. Amongst your friends list, if you find that you have more female friends than you have male friends, and you have more female friends or feminine energy whom you confide in when you have issues, then it's an indication that you were feminized. You grew up pedestalizing a woman and seeing a woman that's actually reliable, competent, and seeing a man as unreliable, incompetent, and therefore, as a young child going through your boyhood phase, you always ran back to mummy for your problems to be solved, and both emotional and general societal. And mummy was always a great support system. I'm not criticizing mum's responsibilities to you. What I'm saying is that if you were raised in the absence of a strong father, or you were raised with a feminine father, or with an absent father, then you never really saw the masculine presence, and therefore didn't really get to develop what I would call the awe, the admiration for a man, as you have for a woman. You went from a home where a woman was competent to the schools where the teachers were competent and women. And even when you went to college, you found actually most of the women were the most competent. The men were slightly weak. So item number 13 is take an audit of your friends list. If you have more female friends or an equal amount of female to male friends, then you're leaning towards having the beta tendencies. Now, are there exceptions to the rule? Of course. But I know for a fact that if you were raised amongst more girls than you were boys, the likelihood is high. And if you go through each of the items, the 12 items I have shared previously, and you find that actually it applies to you, the likelihood is very high. Now, if you confide, now I know one person particularly that comes to mind. And before we became friends, and before we started interacting, and he confided that it came naturally to him to go to women. And when I sat down with him and I went through the process of asking questions about his childhood, you could say that his father was not someone who he always went to. He had a feminine father, but he also had a very masculine mother. She was assertive, she was dominant, and she was very driven. His father was slightly more floaty. In other words, what you had was a reversal of roles in their family. And therefore, he grew up seeing women and being around women, and therefore came to see women as a competent sex. There's nothing wrong with that. And never really saw his father as someone he could go to for questions, solving life problems. Now, this man in question would go to women to solve his masculine problems, both relationally and otherwise, rather than seek men. So that's number 13. Again, are there exceptions to the rule? Of course. But in the majority, on a balance of probabilities, that's the key thing, key phrase to keep in mind. If you have more female friends, if you find that it's easy for you to make more female friends than it is male friends, if you can find more in women with regards to most of your affairs about life, work, business, social, relational, emotional, you can find more in women than men. You have a beta tendency. And number 2 has to do with, or rather, number 14, but number 2 in today's session, but number 14 in the overall list has to do with an interesting concept called boundary setting and boundary enforcement. I'm speaking specifically in this instance to relationships. But how you do anything is how you do everything. If you find that you struggle very hard to set boundaries from the get-go, from the start, as a matter of fact, a man who is not aware of his purpose, his ambition, his drive, his vision, his mission, his focus, and goes into a relationship, would always go into that relationship from a partnership perspective. Now let's go back to yesterday's session where I talked about the 50-50 partnership. Men who lean towards 50-50 partnership, or the partnership in relationships, rather than leadership and responsibility and duty and obligation, tend to have beta tendencies on the basis that they have never really had boundaries set for them. This will be what we call child men, almost Peter Pan syndrome. You've never really grown up primarily because there were no fathers, or a feminine father, an absent father, with the whole concept of boundary setting and boundary enforcement. I should make it very clear. Mothers and fathers set boundaries at a similar rate. Fathers enforce boundaries at a rate much higher than mothers do, because it comes instinctively. A mother cares more about a boy's or a child's emotional needs in the present. A father is more likely to look towards the future and say, I care more about your potential and win, rather than winning your immediate affection, and therefore I will sacrifice who you are today for who I think you should become. Therefore, you tend to find that delayed gratification is a key component of boys who were raised with good fathers, masculine fathers rather than feminine fathers. So men who have difficulty with regards to setting and enforcing boundaries within the context of a relationship tend to have beta tendencies, because it goes against their nature. Why? You have that whole concept of order and chaos. Chaos is to be free-spirited. Order is to simply say, well, there are guardrails and we have a vision. And let me expand that slightly further. You and I meet, and this has been the same concept with me from day one. It's been the same concept with men I know who have an idea about who they are and where they're going. I have always had a clear vision of what I wanted my life to be. So if I was single and I met a woman, on day one, I would lay out not my entire vision, not my entire plan, not my purpose, but an indication that that is my true north. That is where I'm going to. I won't be distracted by that. Now, she then has the opportunity to say, well, I don't like his true north. I don't like his direction. And his is opposite to mine. Now, there's a concept that says, how can two walk together except they agree? In other words, you can't have two visions in the same house. One vision has to support the other. Beta males tend to go on the basis of 50-50 vision, which means there's confusion. Whenever you do not have order, you cannot be in a state of, you might say, self-mastery and focus. Because order, or the absence of order, allows for temptations to come through. You know, the great writer says, forgetting the things that are behind me, I move towards my goal, looking neither to the left or to the right. Men who have the beta traits struggle with boundary enforcement. Why? Primarily because they do not have a purpose. Now, if you go back to the sessions I started with, I talked about how a lack of purpose is usually at the core. And here is the key part of what I'm about to share. Your purpose is your why. It's that reason that drives you. That purpose will create a vision. Your vision will lead you to have discipline. So your discipline is birthed from a vision, an idea of what you're trying to achieve. From that vision and that discipline, you develop goals. You then have a strategy, which is how you get from A to B. And then you have what we call daily routines or habits. Those daily habits, in many ways, are supposed to take you every day progressively towards the goal. A man who has an idea about where he's trying to get to, in many ways, is enslaved to the overall purpose. Remember, purpose is the reason why you were born. To have a purpose-driven life, therefore, comes either as a result of you discovering your purpose or choosing a purposeful life or something that you believe requires your attention. Therefore, you submit to the vision that comes from your purpose. So as a man in meeting a woman, you're not enforcing any undue burden on her. You're simply saying, that is my purpose. This is my vision. These are the disciplines that I have enacted in my life. I've set those boundaries. There are guardrails. Within the guardrails, we can play. The relationship can evolve. However, they are set. Now, it doesn't mean you don't revisit your vision. It does mean you're not changing your vision every day. But certainly, you're not changing your vision for a woman or a man or another, because your vision effectively is part of your great motivation, your reason for being. So men who struggle with boundary setting, boundary enforcement, who have no vision, who struggle with having a purpose, who lack discipline, and who will not enforce discipline. Now, generally speaking, in terms of symbolism, the feminine is symbolic of what we call chaos. It's expressive. It explores. It's creative. The masculine is symbolic with what we call order. It's more rigid. The dance between both is where you get the best, you might say the best of both worlds. However, if you have a purpose and a meaning to your life, it would do you more good to have boundaries, because it means you're not chasing too many shadows and therefore you're not distracted. In modern dating today, a man who has standards is seen as misogynistic, sexist, dominant, controlling, narcissistic, and any other variation of all such words. Part of the reason I alluded to in the sessions prior, we live in a gynocentric society where men have been raised over the past 60 to 70 years to consider the masculine image or the masculine presence as a threat. We believe in this patriarchy where men set up their rules to benefit themselves at the expense of women, a concept that is preposterous and idiotic. In any case, most women since the 1960s raised their sons to be softer men, raised their daughters to be harder women, which is why you can see women say, well, I want to be successful in my career, I want to have X and Y and Z. And society praises such women as being driven, independent, go-getters, successful, and career-focused. When those women talk about what they want in relationships, we say they have good taste. We also say that they are very familiar with where they're trying to get to. We praise their standards. We look at and we lord over their preferences. The reason society supports such a woman is because we live in a gynocentric society. A boy raised by a mother who is feminized is told, no, your testosterone is a problem. The masculine energy is toxic, and therefore you should be soft. And these men were feminized. So most men in relationships do not have boundaries. They do not have limits, things they will not tolerate. Now, recognize, I'm not talking about physical. I'm not referring to physical rules within a relationship. I'm referring more to the fact that you simply say, I, as a man, am limited by my vision because I actually am serving my vision. I have submitted to that purpose and calling. And if I'm going to be in a relationship with you, then you have a choice to either accept, submit to the same vision so that we are both walking together in the same spirit, or you can choose that it's not for you. Most men, men who have the beta installation, are too soft, too afraid. They've been feminized so much that they think that there's something wrong about having standards. Now, number 15, and I close with regards to the list. I started a session and I explained in the first session that if you are in the West, there's an 80-20 split. On a balance of probabilities, about 80% of men who were born in the West since, you might say, the 1960s, the baby boom generation, Generation X, millennials, or Generation Y, Generation Z and A, 80% of all men in that group, on a balance of probabilities, have the beta gene or installation. Only 20% are what you would call non-beta males. In areas outside of the West, where they haven't solved necessarily the whole issue about the need for survival, and where they still operate at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you tend to find that the traditional gender roles and the traditional gender obligations are still intact. And then you have a swing. In those areas, it's more 80 to 90% of men are more complete, and only about 10 to 20% of men have the beta genes. Now, here is the key part of everything I'm perhaps relating to what I just shared. In the West, there were two things that actually caused a lot of these, you might say, things to evolve and develop. Number one, the ability of women to have children outside of wedlock. And number two, the ability of women to have a divorce whenever they wanted to, with no financial, economic, relational, or even familial penalties. Those two things, in addition to the fact that we had solved the need for survival, caused most women to come to a state where they do not understand the need for a man. And therefore they've raised their children with a surrogate father, which is the government, in such a manner that protection from a man is not needed. And most women, therefore, what they are looking for is a man to simply profess his or her love to her. So intimacy, affection, and romance is the key focus of most women. Why? They can earn, but if they cannot earn, they can be supported. And the government provides protection. So in the West, we have women who do not need men. Some of them want men, but they want men at their terms. Now, the 15th item, number 15, or number 3 in today's session is, as a default, if you're 35 years old in the West, or younger, but particularly if you're 30 years old or younger, on a balance of probabilities, going back to the 80-20 reference I made earlier, you have the beta installation. If you were born or raised in the West, on a balance of probabilities. So it has more to do with disposition and often age than anything else. Now, you might go through the 15 items on my list and you might tick items off, but there's a simple way you can go through the process. If I was sat with a woman and she said to me, well, I'd like to choose someone as a spouse, someone who I will call a husband. And I'm looking at all of these continents. And I'm looking for the best person who would fit on a balance of probabilities. My response would be a simple one. If you choose from the West, in 8 out of 10 times, you would choose a man with a beta installation. If you choose outside of the West, in 8 to 9 out of 10 times, you will find a man who is more or less complete and does not have the beta installation. Number 2, if the man is 35 years and younger, in the West particularly, you're more likely going to find a man who has a beta installation. I'll go back to something I said in a session that I did many, many months ago, so perhaps even years. I talked about the tenets that men should consider. And this is key, because this, if you understand this concept, and I'll bring today's session to a close, if you understand this concept for men, it would make sense. I may not be able to state all of them, but I provided tenets. I provided a similar tenet for women. At least you accuse me of being sexist. It was a simple one. I split men into 3 groups, 0 to 18, to which I said, or rather, you might say 0 to 17, to which I said, you're not officially chronologically an adult. So, your father, your guardian, the men in the group, in the community, should be the ones guiding you. But I call you in any way preschool. 18 to 35, I consider you're chronologically an adult, so you can make decisions for yourself, so you can listen to someone like myself or reject someone like myself, but you are an adult. The first group, I cannot override your parents. The second group, perhaps I can give you some advice. That doesn't mean I won't provide some guidance for the first group. 35, 36 and above, I considered postgraduate, so the middle group, undergraduate. 35 and above, postgraduate, you're an adult, you're a mature person. You can make your choices yourself. And I said, for men who are below 35, but particularly 18 to 35, here are some tenets. Now, if you excel in this tenets, the likelihood of actually you being beta is very low. Number 1, I simply said, your main focus should be your purpose. 18 to 30, all you should focus on, take 95% of your entire time, education. 18 to 22, 5 years education. You might travel for a year, and then you start working. Let's say 24 all the way up to 30, your career. I allow an extra 20% because men tend to do things not in a straight line. It takes about 10,000 hours of practice to become really competent in anything you do. There are 2,000 work hours every single year, so 2 times 5 years is 10,000 hours. But if we assume it would take you an extra 20% to get to your competence, because in the first year maybe you change jobs and not quite happy where you are, we call it 6 years. So from 24 end to 30, you've got your 6 years. You have some mastery in something. At the time, 95% of your focus is your success in your profession. You're building wealth, you're reinvesting or investing both in yourself and in developing financial assets, real assets or real estate, in whatever form it comes, and social capital. Complete focus. 5% of your time you should allocate to relationships and women. But I also state, tenet number 2, you should not be or be in a mono relationship with anyone during that phase at all. You might have needs, I make no judgment. Have a few plates spinning. Distribute your energy, because otherwise you'll be drawn into making the third tenet and the mistake associated with the third tenet, which is do not get anyone pregnant in that period between 18 and pre-18 and 35. Do not. Now, when you get to 30, you've achieved a level of, you've got your education, you've got your success, you've got your career going, or a good job, but you haven't developed your purpose. Because the first phase is to apprentice under someone and be paid for, so you develop a base. The second phase is 30 to 35 is where you focus on your purpose, which is where you fail. Most men who have the beta installation have not failed really. You need 5 extra years. 30 to 35 is the years of failure. Take that idea or dream you have and put it to the test. Fail, start again, fail, start again. Every man is only as faithful as the temptations he has overcome. Every man is only as successful as the temptations he's been able to overcome. So during that phase, 5 years, 30 to 35, you're building what we'll call the foundation of your life. The job in your career gives you something to fall back to. Your purpose in the calling gives you something to aspire to. Now from 35, you can start tolerating or entertaining long-term relationships. From 30, you can start to consider. I also said number 4, as part of the tenet, do not, between 18 and 35, live with a woman or move in with a woman. You need your space. Now, there are others I provided, but can you see that the 4 tenets at the core help you develop your masculinity? So you move from boyhood to manhood. The journey from boyhood to manhood is almost similar to going through the fire, where you're built. Now, let me bring today's session to a close by addressing the 3 things I covered as a summary. Number 1, it's important you understand, right, I should say, number 13, if you prefer spending more time with women than men, beta, that's a sign. Number 2, if you do not find it easy to set boundaries, and you will not set boundaries, and you have this fluidity in your relationship about the future, beta. And if you're 35 and younger, but particularly 30 and younger, beta. Now, the key question that I want to cover in the session that follows is a simple one. Is how do you fix it? First question. Second question, why should you fix it? Now, the question about how you fix it, I'll share some of the things I had shared previously. Number 1, accountability, humility, and honesty, and acceptance. Remember, this is not a criticism on you as a person. Accountability, humility and honesty, and acceptance. Number 2, identify the items in the list of 15 that apply to you and why. For example, it could be absent father, masculine mother, or feminine father, or just general things in your social environment that cause you to develop and have this installation in you. Remember, someone else may have been responsible for getting you to where you are currently. You are responsible for getting yourself from where you are to where you want to get to. A key word, you do not have to live your life like you have in the past 5, 6, 2, 4, 10 years. You can change. So you have to identify the reasons that have led you down this path of having a beta gene. Number 3, identify the kind of person you would want to become. You get to choose. It's one thing saying this is, I think I have the beta installation. The question is, who do you want to become? So you identify the ideal person you want to become, and perhaps using role models might be useful. Here's a key part. When you've made that identification, you have to list why you want to become that person, and even more importantly, when. If you said, well, it looks like I'm a beta male, or I have the beta genes, and I want to become someone who is more, you might say, fuller. I want to become my best self, but I want to do that in 10 years. Then that is not a goal. The timeline is to find the future. Now, number 4, identify the resources that you would need to get you from where you are currently to where you want to get to. Time, money, investments, finding a coach, finding a mentor, finding new friends, allowing yourself to be influenced by the right people. Number 5, create a plan. Create a plan. And number 6, get to work. I'll try to cover these items in the session that follows because I think these are the most important. Now, I've made 15 items, but the key thing is, okay, how can you fix it? Now, I may not be able to give you all the answers. You will have to go out and find answers yourself. But the key parts that I think should not be overlooked is why should you fix it? I'll leave you with the following sentences. There's a saying, the sins of the fathers live unto the children into the 3rd and the 4th generation. And when I use the word sin, lots of people seem to think this is a religious conversation. It isn't. In Aramaic or in archery, the word sin simply means to miss the mark. So if you take a shot, but you miss the target, they call it one sin. In other words, you miss the mark. Men who have the beta installation have missed the mark. What we're trying to identify is how do we get them back on the mark? So the why is key. Now, sins of the fathers live onto the 3rd and the 4th generation. It means if you have a beta installation, as I said to a friend of mine who said to me, I can't, someone I know, he said, I tend to find that I want more dominant women because I'm actually quite passive in relationships. But over the long term, if I look back at the relationship that I have had, they always end because the woman gets frustrated with his lack of leadership, and he gets frustrated in himself for a lack of being a leader. And so I said to him, well, and he said, well, I find it uncomfortable to be with feminine women because they're looking for more leadership and masculinity, which I do not have. So I'm stuck. And I said to him, and this is a key part of today's teachings, I said, why don't you do it as a gift to your children and your children's children? Will it be hard? Yes. Will it be uncomfortable? Yes. But what you're doing is you're in many ways rewriting what could be a generational curse. I can say this with some level of certainty. I can say it with some level of conviction. The beta gene, or the beta trait in men, is not a long-term viable strategy for both men and for women. Any nation is only as strong, successful, as its men. The beta installation simply means that we are trending towards weakness. And therefore, if you find that you have the gene, or you have the traits, what you're trying to do is rewrite the next generation that comes from your loins, where you're simply saying, no, what? No, I will do what is uncomfortable because, like the software, there's something wrong. There's an error code in the software installation. Now, I hope all of this has been useful.